teammates are no longer with us.
Probably a third of the players and all of the coaches.
How does that make this year different?
Lonely. I truly miss a lot of those guys. I miss my teammates, the ones that are gone, I truly miss.
50 years later, those that remain still celebrate their achievement. In their youths, they did something no one else has ever done. They were the perfect machine.
I talked to Buzz Aldrin once. I asked him, what was it like to walk on the moon? I still don't know what it's like. I only know what he told me. There's no way I can explain to you what it's like to win every game. We're the only ones that get to relish in the actual feeling.
I'm just wondering, I'm oh so tired of wondering, I'm just wondering, when will these old troubles let me be?
That was incredible. Welcome, everybody. I'm Dave Briggs, a member of the Library Board of Trustees, a 20-year broadcaster. It's just it's a lot of pride that we host brilliant films like that in this beautiful forum. I want to welcome up Jeremy Schaap, the most talented storyteller in the business today, a good friend of mine. Producer Dan Lindberg and editor Matt McCormick.
Thank you, Dave.
Where are your boys?
They're coming.
They're coming.
You know, Matt dressed up for the occasion. You'll see in a second. Apparently, he didn't get the memo that he was going to be up on stage, but I like the flannel. It's it's very you and Dan.
It's a good look.
Yeah, I like it.
Good to see you
We're
guys.
casual
Well done.
here.
So we want to take your questions. We want this to be a conversation, not just up here talking. So we will factor them in throughout the conversation. Just please use the microphone over there in the corner. And we'll incorporate your questions into the conversation. And if you, Zonka, don't ask a question, we're disappointed. We love the jersey. Well done. This is a brilliant piece, guys. You know, I have to confess, I hated this team.
You weren't even alive. How could you hate that team?
I'll tell you why real quick, and now I love them.
I know why.
I grew up in Denver, a Bronco fan, and we hated Mercury Morris, Nick Buoniconti, and Bob Greasy for dancing on our one loss. I covered the New England Patriots in '07. I was on the edge of the field getting ready to cover perfection, and they danced on that loss.
David Tyree.
They truly are a lovable team, I will say. I've come around. Jeremy, who embodies that team the most? Is it Shula? Is it Greasy? Is it Mercury Morris?
I think Larry Zonka was really the face of that team and has remained the face of that team for half a century. He was a great player. He's charismatic. You know, he's one of those, you know, to borrow the cliche, you know, one of those lunch pail guys. You know, he's clearly enjoying the contact, and you know, he's a Hall of Fame career. But that team is about Don Shula and what he built.
I learned a lot in watching this piece. I want each of you to kind of reflect on what surprised you the most going through this process and learning about perfection.
And he's a Jets fan, so
Sorry.
it wasn't easy for him.
We needed more Namath in this piece, as far as I know. Just how much they went through. You know, you think an undefeated season's easy, but there's just so much. You know, the alligator story. Like they clearly didn't like their coach, and you know, it's probably a love-hate relationship. But just, you know, you think a season like that's all roses, and clearly there was a lot to get through.
Was that alligator story publicly known, or it was?
Oh, yeah. Dan, from day one, I think he did this just for the alligator story, actually.
And they did tie the mouth shut, I presume.
It's kind of
because it wasn't revealed.
They did.
Yes. They did.
They did tie. They put electrical tape on the mouth, but
And
it was by one vote that it happened. Though.
It was actually a vote.
They actually did vote on it, and Jim Kick was not the swing vote, but he was part of the group that said, I voted against.
That is remarkable. What surprised you the most? What did you learn about this?
You know, the first thing I did was ESPN obviously has unbelievable archives, and a lot of these guys have been interviewed throughout the years. So the first thing I did was try to pull as many of those old archival interviews as we could. For the deceased players, I wanted to incorporate them, but obviously I just wanted to see some of the living players, kind of how they talked. And if you've ever seen an interview with Larry Zonka, every time that he's been interviewed that I saw, he's very matter of fact, very just straight to the point, you know, answers the question. So we interviewed him last, you know, it was kind of circumstantial, but, you know, we didn't need him to be great. We just wanted him to be kind of the way that he had always been. And I was so unbelievably surprised at how charismatic and reflective, and just how he was talking with his hands and laughing and smiling. It just was so different than everything I had seen. And then towards the end of the interview, Jeremy asked him that question about the 50th anniversary, which we interviewed him, I think, a week or two after that had happened. And when he gave that response about being lonely and missing his teammates, it clicked with me that this guy has such an appreciation for that season now that he did not have in 72 or maybe 82 or 92. As the years have passed, he just had a reflection that was completely different, and it showed in the interview. And yeah. I was blown away by how good he was.
I think that's such an important point Dan makes, you know, because people say, 72 Dolphins, people have seen the story of the 72 Dolphins. There have been 100 documentaries made. So why do it? Well, it is a big round anniversary. That's one factor. But it's also, you know, these guys, and we do a lot of these historical things, when they're at different points in their lives, they have a different way of looking back on things. There are different moments where they're prepared to talk about it. When they've really, when it's not coming to terms with, but when they've really processed it emotionally, and especially when guys been retired for just a little while, it's like, I just want to move on. Like, I don't want to live in the glory days. I don't want it to be a Bruce Springsteen song. But when they're 75, they realize these were the glory days. And I can take pride in it. And I can talk about it, and it doesn't reflect badly on me that, you know, I was a professional athlete, and the greatest thing that happened to me in my life happened when I was 25. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, Mercury Morris said, he's like, this is the 50th anniversary. None of us are going to be around for the 75th. So he kind of...
Except maybe Mercury. I mean, look at him.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, what the hell is that guy eating, drinking?
It was intimidating. It was very intimidating. Yeah, I mean, I've never seen, I mean,
76.
He's 75. Now he's 76. Yeah, he's unbelievable. The energy, the enthusiasm. I had never talked to him before. Dan and I were down there in Miami in October. And I mean, we could have spent all day with him. He's amazing.
And one of the great lines of the film, which is a crescendo of disgust, and Don Shula reminding them what that game film was like. Right. That's a great band name. Did anything surprise you in telling of this story?
Yeah, you know, I just think, you know, the stuff about Shula. I mean, I knew Shula a little bit later. In life, because, you know, I'm 53. I had barely been born when this team was around. And, you know, when I had spent time around with him, he'd been very avuncular and he had mellowed, as people do, but that Don Shula, the guy they describe, the initial meeting with Little, with Zonka, all of that, this guy was business. I mean, in a way that Lombardi wasn't. I'm not saying he's greater than Lombardi. I'm not saying he's greater than Belichick. We can have all those debates about, whoever you want to have a debate about, Hallis, et cetera, but he was the most intense. I think, wired differently.
I had the opportunity to cover Belichick for a number of years, and I can tell you those players did not love Bill Belichick.
Right.
But they sure as hell respected him. What was the feeling that those guys had for Don Shula? I couldn't quite tell.
They loved him. They hated him. They loved him. They hated him. But they were winning. And what I'm most proud of about this doc is that it's on the 72 Dolphins, but the 72 season doesn't start until the second segment. And we intentionally did that because it's so important to show how all these guys came and became members of the Dolphins. And it was really a chain of events that started in 1966 when the team was formed, that culminated in the 72 season. But all the losing, with high draft picks, and Joe Thomas was so good, so Greasy, Kick, Zonka, all those guys were there for the losing. And Shula came in and whipped them into shape. But, I think Jeremy said it perfectly. He was all business. And they were some guys said they were flat out terrified of him.
These guys, I got to say, Matt and Dan, I mean, when you watch one of these things, if you're not in the business, you might think, oh, it's easy to find all this stuff and to, synthesize it and to make it something coherent. I mean, it's one of the challenges, too, is that there's so much great archival about these guys to find the real gems. And the stuff before Shula gets there with George Wilson, I mean, it's just remarkable to me looking at it again. These guys really lived it in the edit room for so long. How every contemporaneous bite, or I should say every contemporary now bite is backed up by something from the moment back then, 50 years ago. There's a sound bite that matches what they're saying now with what they said then. You see Mercury Morris now say something, there he is saying it in 1970. There's Jim Del Gaizo. It's Gaizo, right? Or Gaizo. How do you say it?
Del Gaizo.
Gaizo. Yeah. I didn't get it right either time. And he's amazing, right? Like the third string quarterback, what he had to say. Saying something now, saying something then. It's just remarkable.
What would you want kids that have never even heard of this team to know about this unique group?
Well, it's weird because I've become kind of defensive about it. I mean, I'm not a Dolphins fan or anything, but I'm a fan of the 72 Dolphins because of this. And, it's kind of funny. Inadvertently, I kind of stirred something up a few weeks ago. I mean, to the extent that you stir something up on Twitter it wasn't me, but I just tweeted like a trailer promoting the piece that, these guys have put together with Scott Sikowski, one of our producers, and I said, not just the greatest team ever, but a great, collection of characters. Never even thinking that that's controversial, but I guess I should have. And then nobody follows my Twitter feed, but Adam Schefter, people do follow, and he retweeted it.
A few
and
million.
Then you had Patriots fans, I'm coming out of the woodwork, not the greatest. They would have gotten crushed. I want people to understand they're the only ones. That's pretty simple to comprehend, right? But as Mercury said, they led the league in scoring defense. They led the league in scoring offense. They led the league in total defense. They led the league in total offense. Nobody else has ever done that. He said some other things about leading the league in takeaways and also fewest turnovers. They get diminished sometimes because their opponent's overall record was like 380 or something. Very weak historically, but they beat everybody they put out there in front of them, and they did it on both sides of the ball.
I'm glad you brought that up because it is remarkable how much debate there is around that. ESPN's own list does not have them as the number one team.
Oh, which one do they have?
They, in fact, have the 85 Bears.
Well, they're
Is that? Would you agree?
They're just wrong. I mean.
And then the other one is Bleacher Report, who's known for their list. They have the 62 Packers. Why don't they get the respect? That number one offense, number one defense, perfect season. Why don't they get that respect.
I wasn't born then. I'm not sure, but I mean,
Neither was
it is
I,
interesting.
but-
Though, if you look at all three playoff scores, they were one possession games. Looks like they were very close.
Well, you could say that, all right. They were close games, and, they had that close call with the Vikings, et cetera. But, again, every other team has lost a game. Every other team has had more than a close call. They're the only ones, obviously, who, ended up winning them all.
I think a lot of today's...
Again, I'm defensive. I don't know
Today's fans might knock it down a peg because there's less games back then. I mean, it doesn't matter to people back then, but, some, like, the Patriots went 18-0 at that point, right? I mean, that's why they care.
But
I don't.
but let's just, all right. So they're the only one that's undefeated. They led in total and scoring on both sides of the ball. They also lost their first team All-Pro quarterback in week 5 and won the next 11 games. And they had to go on the road, which no team undefeated will ever have to do again, to get to the Super Bowl in the title game.
I want to address all those things.
I
full admission, had no idea who Earl Morrall was. I did not. 17th season, 38 years old. How remarkable is that part of this story?
It's the thing that floored me the most.
Me too.
I'm 41 years old, so the first thing I did was just try to read as much as I could about this team. And I'm a Boilermaker, so I was a big Bob Greasy guy. And when I found out that he had gotten hurt as early as he did, I started looking up at Earl Morrall's numbers, and I was like, this guy? Him? But that's kind of why we made the point that Shula and every one of these guys, it's something I wish we could have included. Every single guy that we talked to said Shula was great, but Shula had the best assistant coaches that any coach could ever have. The offensive line. The offensive line was a bunch of ragtag guys that no other team wanted. The running back coach, Carl Tassif, took, he's the first guy to have 2,000-yard rushers in the same backfield. They just all came together, and as I was telling people as I was preparing this, I said, who's the main character of this story? I said, well, this team didn't have one. They did not have a main character. Everyone just did their job. And that's what impressed me the most.
And nothing embodies that more than the no-name defense. Do you know where they got that name? Did they embrace that?
I don't know.
I think it was Landry from Super Bowl VI. I think it was Tom Landry that dubbed them.
Tom Landry called them.
I believe.
I didn't know that.
I think so. I don't know.
And did they embrace that?
I don't know if they embrace that.
There's the purple people eaters, the steel curtain.
The no-name defense. Obviously,
defense.
I don't think Landry meant it as an insult. He wasn't that kind of guy. But it did speak to the idea that, it wasn't a bunch of superstars. Nick Bonaconte is the only defensive guy on the team in the Hall of Fame. And you think about the other great teams, right? You mentioned those 60s Packers, all right? So who's in the Hall of Fame from the defense alone? It's Willie Wood, it's Herb Adderley, it's Willie Davis, it's Ray Nitschke, it's also Dave Robinson. That's one team, okay? The Steelers defense, a few years later, the guys that they beat there, who were some of them weren't there yet. They were just coming up. 5 of those guys are in the Hall of Fame, right? Yeah. It's one guy. And yet, what they did, and it's before the advanced statistics, and it's before sack statistics and all that kind of stuff. They're kind of in this zone where they don't get the appreciation. And a lot of those guys had this incredible year, but they didn't have I shouldn't say they didn't have incredible careers. They didn't have the same kind of careers as some of those Hall of Famers I'm talking about.
Again, we want to take any of your questions. If you have them, please hop over there to the mic. I think the segregation element was something that I didn't think about ahead of this either. Was that an issue on other teams at the time? Was Don Shula unique in blending that immediately, and how important was that for their journey?
We asked a lot of guys about that in particular. Larry Little was from Miami, and Larry Little talked about growing up going to the Orange Bowl, and seating at the Orange Bowl was segregated. So he, that's how he grew up. And I just think that, this was, 1969. So, I mean, we're a couple years removed from the Cuban Missile Crisis and, Vietnam and things. So I think when you're doing an anniversary piece about 50 years ago, I think it's important to, let people kind of, or just remind people of where you were or where people were in, a time from as far as society goes. As far as other teams, we asked, and Marv Fleming was a great interview, and he talked about Lombardi and the Packers and how it wasn't an issue for Lombardi because, what he said went. And, Bob Greasy mentioned in his book about rooming with Paul Warfield and how Shula did that to make a point. But it wasn't strictly that. I mean, they were all-pro quarterback, all-pro wide receiver. It made sense. But a lot of guys had different stories about it. Marv said in his interview, he said when he came in and said, "You guys mind if I get dressed here on the Mason-Dixon line?" He said everyone kind of looked at him, and he said the next day when he came to the locker room, offense was over here and defense was over there. So it worked, and he was kind of the savvy veteran, the guy that everybody respected. But there were a couple different anecdotes and stories. Mercury Morris was talking about when he first got there, how there were different showers and there was different water temperature for the white players and then for the black players. And Merc was a guy that just he told a story about how he just decided to go shower in the hot water. And, people were looking at him, but, he's Merc. He didn't really care. But there were a bunch of just really unique stories, but we just kind of had to pick, the one that was clearest and that made our point, but we didn't want to get, too in the weeds in that.
You want to elaborate?
No, I was just going to say about Marv Fleming, and I've known Marv a long time, not well, but he was one of those Packers that my father, Dick Schaap, was really close with, all those guys from the 60s teams. And he's always a great storyteller. And I think Marv played in 5 of the first 7 Super Bowls, right? So he played in 1 and 2 for the Packers. He played in 6 or 5 of the first 8, 6, 7, and 8 for the Dolphins. And he's a guy people don't even remember, but he was a great player. He was a great blocker, and a great storyteller. And that's what's fun about this. These guys, they still have their fastballs, telling these stories and looking back. And one of the things I love the most, what Matt and Dan really achieved here is it feels like it's the 70s. The music, the film treatment, the visuals, all of it, you feel, and I think that's so important, these kind of immersive historical kind of things, all of that stuff, beyond the sound bites, beyond the tracks that get you from point A to point B, it's just capturing the feel of that time in Miami in the early 70s. And I think that was achieved.
And you mentioned the collection of characters on this team, and another guy that I think a lot of people weren't familiar with, Garo, and I got to write the name down, Garo Yepremian. This guy is unlike anything I've ever seen, maybe in NFL history. What makes him such a unique character and one you wanted in this story?
I mean, first of all, you just look at him. I mean, he's literally selling ties out of the back of his car at training camp.
Got practice.
Practice, yeah.
Because presumably they made so little at the time, he needed to?
I assume so, and I think on top of that, he was just a quirky guy,
Yeah,
Entrepreneurial.
Yes.
Dan did a great job setting up Garo in Seg 3 for the big moment in Seg 4. But again, on a team that was undefeated, there were very few hiccups. And that play, I mean, I was a kid growing up in the 80s, and that was on every commercial for the blooper VHS tape that you could buy. And it's still, like we said, it's still one of the most infamous plays in the history of sports,
It's iconic.
It's bad. It's very bad. It's very bad. And I know Dan loves this too. One of the things, you can't get everything in there. It doesn't all fit. But one of my favorite things that didn't make it is Dave Shula, who was 13 at the time, telling us the story how he kind of, in a way, is responsible for Garo Yepremian trying to throw that pass because he was their ball boy. And as we said, Shula didn't really let Yepremian practice with the team. So he didn't really have much to do. There are only he could only kick so many times during a practice. So he'd play catch with Dave Shula. And he's trying to, learn football. And so the other guys are busy. They're not hanging out with the 13-year-old kid throwing the ball, but Garrow would play catch with him. So the whole 2 weeks before the Super Bowl in Miami, in LA, he's playing catch. So in that moment, Dave Shula is thinking to himself, he's throwing it because now he thinks he knows how to throw a football because we've been playing catch. Otherwise, he would have done what Don told him to do in such situations.
Fall on it.
Fall on it.
Yes, sir.
Hi, everybody. My name's Paul. I'm a teacher in town, but I grew up in Miami, and I went to high school with the Greasy kids and the Shula kids. And I want to compliment you guys for the kind of endearing story that you've made here. Because I've seen lots and lots of clips and little stories and little packages and anecdotes through the years of that team. But I think you guys did a really, really masterful job of kind of capturing emotion and, hard emotion and the love of team and all of those things. You guys did a really good job of kind of like mining all of that history and boiling it down into a way that I think even people who didn't know much about that team can really kind of feel for that club at that time.
What do you think separates it from all the pieces you have seen about this team?
I think that, I've seen a lot of things, and there's this, the kind of like Monday morning quarterback thing of who had better stats and, this debate thing. But you guys captured it more of a the humanistic the way that you kind of tied it all together. And it goes to what you guys are talking about. It's like over time, you become less and less tied into, who had a better completion percentage. It's more about, okay, we really wanted to win. And who was going to do that for us? Don Shula. And we did everything he asked us to do. And it was painful, but here we are. And we did something that, now this team is a part of history. And I just think that you guys were able to kind of distill that story in a way that it was less about statistics and, rah-rah, and it's more about just what people can do when they really work together. So kudos to you guys.
Thank you so much. That's very, very kind of you to say. Thank you. All right, I like this. Who's next? All right, let's go. No.
We would love some more questions. It wasn't just a unique collection of characters. As you pointed out, it was a strange confluence of events, and one of them was the fake punt, which was astounding. A moment that I heard a lot of people shocked to recall. What if that went the other way? And he freelanced that thing, right?
He totally freelanced it. Shula had no idea. A lot of those guys, we asked a lot of those guys about that play, and I think we used Kindig's bite, but Shula had an understanding with him, said, listen, and this wasn't just for that game. He had done that earlier in the year. I believe that's correct. But Shula always told him, he's like, you do this, but you better make it if you're going to do it. And Seipel said, had I not made it, I think it was 4th and 5. He said, if we didn't get a first down, he said, I would have been walking back to Miami. But Shula was a big special teams guy, a huge details guy. But, the week before, Charlie Babb was a backup rookie defensive back. And he saw something on film right as they were breaking practice, and he raised his hand and said, Coach Shula, look how the Browns are blocking this. I think I'd get here and do it. And Shula says, if they give you that look, go and do it. And he blocked a punt, recovered it for a touchdown in the playoff. I mean, this was a rookie backup safety. And Zonka had a bite in his interview. He said, this guy, this rookie, we're all getting ready to leave practice. And this guy raises his hand. And we're all like, oh, my God, we just want to get out of here. And it just speaks to everyone played a role on that team.
But the fake punt, 4th and 5, midfield, gutsiest play a punter ever made. Yes, sir.
Hi, I just want to say, first off, thank you. Excellent film. I'm just old enough to know the story, but not old enough to have experienced it when it was actually happening. And like you said, Jeremy, lots of films about this. But I think you uncovered some really interesting tidbits. What struck me, what really played with my imagination was the 10% ownership that Shula was granted upon becoming the coach. The Broncos just sold, I think the number was somewhere between $4 and $5 billion. I mean, just thinking about that in today's numbers, is there a coach worth $400 or $500 million? And would we ever see something like that again? Just an interesting thing to sort of think about.
The contracts now are enormous. I mean, what did Peyton get? I mean, Peyton might get
$18 million a year.
Yeah, and so he's going to make something like $100 million minimum, right?
Yep.
But you're right. 10% of an NFL franchise at current valuations, when they're multi-billion, as you say, I don't think that's happening again. 10% in 1970 was doable.
How long did he hold on to that? Do we know the history there?
That's a really good question.
I think it was in the Huizenga sale.
He was a wealthy
right?
guy, but
I don't know exactly, but did Huizenga buy from Joe Robbie, or was there somebody in between? I can't remember. I just don't remember, but yeah.
I think it was more of when Super Bowl III, when Shula lost to the Jets. And Namath, that soured Shula's relationship with Rosenblum, who was the owner of the Colts. So there was just kind of this schism between those two after that Super Bowl. So Robbie was adamant that he was going to go out and get him. So he was still under contract when Joe was courting him. So they were the Dolphins actually were, they lost their first round draft pick the following year for tampering because he was still under contract with Baltimore when it happened. But that's how bad Robbie wanted.
Like Belichick.
And the Broncos had to give up the number one.
How many did they lose, the Patriots, to your guys?
It all comes back to the Jets.
Yeah, it all comes back to the Jets.
Yes.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dan. Been in Westport for a few years. I grew up in Kansas City.
Oh.
And
Good luck.
Yeah.
Sunday.
Have fun Sunday.
so it's not about, I'm not trying to talk about the game this weekend, but I was talking, maybe I look a little younger than I really am, but I was old enough to actually attend a few of the Chiefs games when they were playing against, the longest game. I was at that game against the Dolphins. And then I was at the very first game that the Dolphins won in their perfect season. That was in Kansas City. That was the very first game at Arrowhead Stadium. Well, it was the first regular season game. And back then, Arrowhead Stadium was horrible because it was just all cement and the team was lousy and it was a horrible experience. But it's interesting when you're watching this special because you come from, as a fan of your own team, you were talking about the Denver, your connection to the perfect season, or you're talking about the Jets. And my connection is that the Chiefs were ending their dynasty and Miami was starting their dynasty, right? So the Chiefs lost that game because of Upremian. He kicked a field goal, and they had a young quarterback in Greasy, and they had a great wide receiver, and the Chiefs had that as well, but they were aging. And another thing that I thought was very special about your program was the love that these men had for each other. And that was a very touching part of the story of how they, I think through the years, their love has grown for each other and how much not only the moments that they shared in that perfect season, but also what the relationships meant. Thank you.
That's very kind of you to say. I appreciate that. And Vin Canamella's out there, who's a coordinating producer on our show, oversaw the production of this documentary, and he was the one that really said that was kind of the game that put the Dolphins on the map, that the 71 playoff game against the Chiefs, that they won in double overtime, which is still the longest game ever played in NFL history because they just kept going until somebody won. So that was, I'm glad that he made a point of us to make that a moment. So it was very nice of you to say. It's always nice to hear people's personal stories in relation to the work.
Two things occur to me before we wrap this up that I should clarify, because my father would kill me if he were alive. Henry Jordan, I forgot, another Packer defensive player from the 60s. I was like,
That
somebody
literally
else. There's
just popped into your mind?
I forgot. I'm like Robinson, Wood, Adderley, Davis, Nitschke, and Henry Jordan. And the other team was the Super Bowl 11 Raiders, who went 13-1 and won the Super Bowl. So those are the four one-loss teams in the 58 years of the Super Bowl era. The Super Bowl 11 Raiders, the Super Bowl 19, the Super Bowl 17 Washington. Now I'm getting the numbers mixed up.
You guys got that?
Washington in 82, San Francisco in 84, and Chicago in 85. And nobody in 37 years has even had a one-loss Super Bowl championship season.
Remarkable. I don't know what I had for breakfast this morning. How do you do this?
Neither do I, but I try to remember the Packers.
There's also a great story in regard to your dad. And
I love telling, this is my favorite one. You know, it didn't make the piece, but my favorite, one of the things that excited me about this when Dan asked me if I would, be involved with the project, my father had a history with this team, I mean, in a lot of ways, but in particular with Super Bowl 7. So he was the editor at the time of Sport Magazine. And Sport Magazine, for many, many years, awarded the Super Bowl MVP trophy and selected the Super Bowl MVP. And I think usually they got a truck or a sports car. And it was kind of a big deal, as these guys had jobs in the winter, so getting a truck was a big deal. And the award itself was a big deal. So his job was at halftime every year to hand out the ballots in the press box, collect them at the end of the game, tally it up, and announce who won the Super Bowl MVP award. It's much more organized today, I'm sure, than it was in 1972. But he went out late the night before, and he wasn't feeling great that day of Super Bowl 7. Generally just kind of hungover and tired and feeling crappy, and he forgot to hand out the ballots. So now the game is almost over. I guess your Premian has just attempted that great pass, and now the game's about to wrap up, and he's like, oh no, I forgot to hand out the ballots. I guess I just have to pick the MVP myself. And so he's scrambling. He hasn't been paying any attention to the game, barely in the press box. And so he looks at the stat sheet, the one he can find. He sees Jake Scott, the safety, had 2 interceptions. So he's like, okay, it was a defensive game. Jake Scott's the MVP. Let's make Jake Scott the MVP. So he makes, Dan's heard this story a million times. I'm sorry, Dan. So he makes Jake Scott the MVP. The only problem is Manny Fernandez had the greatest defensive game in the history of professional football. 17 tackles. 17 tackles, sacks, and Manny, the story that I always heard growing up is that Manny Fernandez had a dartboard with my father's face on it in his house and wanted to kill him and told people if he ever ran into him, he'd kill him and, tear him to pieces. And Manny Fernandez, he looks like, a very mild-mannered kind of, insurance salesman now, but he was more intimidating back then. And so Dan told me he lined up Manny Fernandez, and I said, I really want to interview Manny Fernandez. I feel I owe him an apology. And so, I relate the story to him, and it's kind of like he barely knew what I was talking about, kind of, and he's like, yeah, no hard feelings. It was all just anticlimactic.
I said to him, our reporter is Jeremy Schaap.
He's like,
and he really wants to interview you. And he goes, this is over the phone, he goes, Schaap. Where do I know that name from? Schaap.
I guess.
I said, well, his father covered the team and, was a, brilliant sports writer. He goes, oh yeah, I know, I remember Dick Schaap. I was like, yeah, there's a story about the Super Bowl. He's like, a long time ago. He remembered.
he remembered.
I'm surprised he got over it.
He got over it.
All right, any last, do we have a question? Go ahead.
So,
Luke.
Being the son of the editor, sometimes I see the documentaries before they're done and I get to know a bit of the background stories and stuff like that. But for this one, I didn't get to see anything, so I saw it all for the first time. And there were a lot of surprising bits and pieces that I didn't know. So I was wondering what did you learn about this that you didn't know before you started it, that like surprised you the most, or you had the most fun learning?
Great question. And
That's
that'll
my son
be our
right there.
last.
Good question.
Unless anyone has anything else, that'll be our last. Real quickly, where can we see it? It's on ESPN Plus.
That's right. And it's re-airing a
And
bunch on ESPN2 and
re-air, so
ESPN
check your
News, but
guide.
if you've got ESPN Plus, you can watch it on demand.
I'd love it if all three of you could answer that terrific question before we go.
Sure.
Go for it.
But I need your help with this. So the one story that I think everybody knows is they toast champagne every year with every loss. And we had that in for a while, and it didn't make the cut because one thing we kind of learned is it's kind of an urban legend myth. Like, some guys maybe do it a little bit. There might be more of a...
Well, Anderson says it started with him.
Yeah, but I mean,
yeah.
for years, like Chris Berman probably made it famous that, like, every time a team lost a game, they were popping champagne as a group. And just came to find out in the storytelling that might have kind of grown over the years from maybe having a beer together to... So that's why ultimately it's kind of been narrowed down in the story to what we saw, which was the initial toast after the 85 Bears game. And we did use it thematically throughout visually, the champagne, which has become a big, part of their celebration.
Bit of an urban legend, though.
Yeah, Dan can back me up on this.
It looks really cool on screen, though, so, I mean.
And your answer to the question as well, what surprised you in making this story?
What surprised me in making this story? I think I was just surprised by just how these guys, we talked a little bit about, the NFL now versus before and with free agency and guys coming and going. This was really before free agency. And, the leagues had just merged. I mean, that's how long ago it was. But the closeness that these guys, the guys that remain, how close they really are. When we interviewed Larry Zonka up in the North Carolinian mountains, super, super far away, we were just staying at this cabin, and we were trying to describe to him where it was so he could come meet us, and he said, oh yeah, 2 weeks ago, Manny Fernandez and Larry, like 3 other guys had all just come up to visit him, and they stayed at that exact cabin. So they all remain unbelievably close to this day, and I don't know if it's because of the history that they share, but I get the feeling it's just because of they really, really all got along, and they loved each other as teammates and as brothers.
And that's why they were perfect. And Jeremy, finish this up.
I was surprised Manny Fernandez didn't want to kill my father. That surprised me because I thought that was definite. I think it's the stuff, Zonka, he gets into a little bit about the sun, going out there the week before to see how the sun is going over the LA Coliseum, the level of detail, the precision, that kind of stuff about Shula. I didn't know. I mean, I knew that he was a hard ass, but I didn't know that he was like obsessive that way. I mean, he didn't go out to LA and stay there he flew out to LA and flew back, and he sat there all day, just like, the sun's that way, knowing like where to be on the sidelines, how to prepare, everything like that. I mean, that level of detail I thought was fascinating. I also hadn't really considered before we started this project, the Hungarian connection in football at the time. Zonka, Shula, Namath, all Hungarian. And there are more than that. So I kept trying to bring it up with the guys, and they didn't really bite. But I thought it was fun.
Well, Jeremy, Matt, Dan, it is a brilliant piece of storytelling. Thank you for sharing it with us. Thank all of you for coming tonight. We really appreciate it.